I remember the cold first, the kind that slips under your coat no matter how tightly you wrap it. I was walking across the parking lot of the Seattle Country Club, watching the warm glow spilling through its tall windows, while snowflakes drifted in slow circles around me. It was supposed to be a Christmas celebration for the Carter family, full of cheer and polished laughter. For me, it had always been a reminder that belonging could look beautiful from the outside and feel empty once you stepped in. Inside, the room pulsed with soft music and the clinking of wine glasses. Every table was covered in deep red linens, polished silverware, and centerpieces tall enough to make conversation difficult. Servers in crisp uniforms moved gracefully through the crowd. I stood near the entrance for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Most people did not notice me arriving. A few glanced over, offering polite smiles before returning to their conversations about investments and new homes on Lake Union. Richard Carter, my adoptive dad, stood near the main tree in his tailored suit, surrounded by business partners. He was laughing at something one of them said, his voice loud and confident. His wife Linda hovered at his elbow, nodding at the right moments. Their biological children, Lisa and Aaron, floated between guests like practiced hosts. I was used to being the background hum at events like this, the quiet presence tolerated out of obligation. I made my way toward an empty spot near one of the smaller tables, planning to stay out of the way I always did. Someone brushed past me and placed an empty glass in my hand without looking, assuming I was part of the staff. I held it awkwardly, unsure whether to correct them or pretend I belonged with the servers. It was always like that here. People saw only what they expected. As the evening went on, the noise grew louder. More guests arrived. Someone uncorked another bottle of expensive wine. I watched from the sidelines, sipping water and pressing my back against the wall to stay out of everyone's path. Every now and then, Richard's eyes met mine, and he would look away just as quickly, as if he had forgotten I was on the guest list. A few minutes later, one of his business partners asked where the rest of his family was. Richard lifted his hand and gestured broadly at the room. Then his gaze slid past me before stopping. He stepped forward, straightening his jacket, and the crowd seemed to quiet around him. I felt it before I heard it. The kind of pause a room takes when something sharp is about to be said. He pointed directly at me and spoke loudly enough to echo off the walls. Go find another table. Real family only. Adopted girls do not belong here. The words hit like cold water straight to the spine. Conversations froze. A few guests exchanged startled glances before covering their discomfort with thin smiles. Someone near the buffet let out a short laugh. Then another joined in, unsure but eager to follow the tone of the room. Laughter spread the way embarrassment always does, rolling outward until it pulled more people with it. I felt my face grow hot, the kind of heat that comes from shame you did not earn. My hand tightened around the empty glass until my fingers ached. Lisa covered her mouth with a dramatic shake of her head, pretending surprise. Aaron looked away. Linda tugged at the sleeve of her dress, pretending she had not heard anything. I stood there, trying to breathe slowly, trying not to let the sting show. I told myself to stay still, to wait, to let the moment pass. That was when one of the caterers approached, a young man carrying a leather folder with both hands. He stopped in front of me and held it out gently. His eyes flicked toward Richard before settling on mine with something like, "Apology. Mr. Carter said you are covering this." He placed the folder in my hands and stepped back. For a few seconds, I could not move. My fingers finally opened the flap, revealing a long, itemized receipt. The number at the bottom pulled my breath from my lungs. $15,270. The entire cost of the party. My vision blurred for a moment. I felt the room sway. Someone behind me whispered that it was generous of me. Another person said something about responsibility. Not one voice objected. Not one person stepped between me and the humiliation. I pulled out my card with a hand that trembled so badly the young caterer reached as if to help, but stopped himself. I signed the receipt, the pen slipping slightly in my fingers. My signature looked nothing like itself. It looked like someone trying to keep their world from falling open in front of a room full of strangers. The moment the pen left the paper, a sound cut through the murmuring. The heavy doors at the entrance swung open. A gust of cold air pushed into the room, and the music seemed to shrink under the weight of it. "Just a moment, please." The voice was low and firm, and every head in the room turned. A woman stepped inside, tall, wrapped in a deep charcoal coat with a fur collar sitting softly around her shoulders. Her gray hair was pinned with a jeweled clip that caught the light each time she moved. People parted around her automatically, whispering her name, Margaret Whitmore. Everyone in Seattle knew who she was. CEO of Whitmore Holdings, a company known for swallowing struggling businesses whole and turning them into empires. Richard had been chasing a contract with her for months, someone between $500,000 and $1 million. He had mentioned it at every family dinner. He said it would change everything. He said he needed it. Now he looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. Margaret did not look at him. She looked at me. Her eyes held something sharp and searching, as if she were looking at a face she had seen before in another lifetime. She stepped closer, the crowd peeling away around her. Finally, she said quietly, almost reverently, "I have found you." My heart thudded once, heavy and disbelieving. For a moment, the noise of the room vanished. All I could hear was the soft echo of her words settling into the hollow spaces inside me. Around us, whispers rose again, thick with confusion and curiosity. Richard's face was drained of color. Wenda's hand flew to her chest. Lisa stared like someone had stolen her spotlight. Aaron blinked as if he could not make sense of the moment. But Margaret kept her eyes on me. Only me. And then, without meaning to, I felt something inside me shift. Not quite hope, not quite fearful, something in between. If you have ever been hurt by your own family, stay with me. This story is only the beginning. Her words were still hanging in the air when the room seemed to fold in around us. Conversations died. Forks stopped in midair. The music faded into a distant hum. For a moment, all I could hear was the soft rustle of someone shifting that weight on the carpet behind me. Richard stepped forward first. His face twitched as he tried to recover the confidence he carried so easily. Minutes earlier, he cleared his throat loudly and said in a strained voice that I was only the adopted one, as if reminding Margaret of some details she had overlooked. Margaret did not even blink. She kept her gaze on me before turning slowly toward him and saying she already knew that. She said the reason she was here was because of me. Her voice did not rise, yet it carried through every corner of that room like a bell. A ripple went through the crowd. Eyes widened, whispers rose like a soft tide, and someone near the dessert table murmured that they had never seen Richard lose color so fast. Margaret stepped closer to me. Her expression softened in a way that made something tight in my chest stir. She said she had been searching for me for almost 20 years. The room shifted again. I felt dozens of eyes on me, measuring confusion and disbelief and something like curiosity. My breath caught. All my life, I had believed my mother had left me because she wanted nothing to do with me. That story had been repeated so often, in small variations, that it had settled into my bones. Hearing anything else felt unreal, like stepping into a memory I did not recognize. Margaret began to speak slowly, carefully, as if unfolding a truth she had carried too long. She said her daughter, Anna Whitmore, had left home in the year 2000, after a painful falling out. She said Anna was young, stubborn, and desperate to build a life that did not resemble the one laid out for her. She said Anna had vanished with only a few bags and a handful of dreams. Margaret paused, then said that in the year 2001, Anna had given birth to a baby girl. Me. My knees felt unsteady. I tried to grasp onto details as they came, but each one hit harder than the last. She said Anna had become ill when I was only 5 years old. She said the sickness progressed too quickly for anyone to make sense of. She said Anna had been alone, terrified, and still trying to protect me until the very end. She said that after Anna passed, I had been placed into the state system. She said paperwork had been filled out incorrectly, records misplaced, names spelled wrong. She said she had searched through shelters, clinics, and orphanages, but the trail kept collapsing each time she inched closer. I felt the floor tilt. Everything I had believed about myself began to shift. My mother had not abandoned me. She had fought for me until she had no strength left. The weight of that truth wrapped around my ribs and tightened until I could hardly breathe. Margaret reached out and rested her hand lightly on my arm. Her touch was gentle, like she was afraid I might break. She said Anna had wanted me. She said Anna had loved me with everything she had. Tears threatened behind my eyes, but I swallowed hard and kept them from falling. My heart ached with something sharp and tender all at once. Then Margaret turned back to Richard. Her face hardened. She asked him if he had ever wondered who I really was, if he had ever questioned where I came from, if he had ever cared enough to ask. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, heavy, accusing. I watched him avoid her stare, his eyes darting toward the guests who were now paying attention in a way they rarely did when Richard spoke. It was clear he was hiding something. He shifted his weight, tugged on his cuff, then glanced at Linda like he expected her to save him. She looked away. Margaret let the silence stretch until it felt like a rope pulled taut. She finally drew in a slow breath and lifted her chin. She said everyone needed to sit down because she had more to say. Her voice carried through the entire ballroom, calm but impossible to ignore. People exchanged uneasy glances. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor. Even the servers paused where they stood. I stood still, unable to move, unable to look away from her. Whatever she was about to say next was going to change everything. The scrape of chairs echoed through the ballroom as people shifted uneasily, lowering themselves back into their seats. The room dimmed slightly when someone stepped away from the wall sconce, and for a moment, it felt like the entire place was holding its breath. I stayed standing where I was, my pulse steady but sharp, waiting for whatever truth Margaret had decided the world needed to hear. She reached into her coat and pulled out a slim folder, the kind used for formal briefings. She set it on the nearest table and opened it with practiced hands. Peter rustled under her fingers. I could feel Richard tense from several feet away, the way someone does when they know exactly what is coming and cannot stop it. Margaret lifted one document and held it where I could see. She spoke clearly, her voice calm but unmistakably firm, as she explained she had gathered years of records and state filings while searching for me. She said she had hoped they would lead her to a child who had been cared for, loved, protected. She looked directly at Richard and Linda before continuing. The first page detailed payments issued by the state of Washington between the years 2002 and 2005. Adoption support funds. I recognized the format from my work in social services. I had helped process similar documents for other children. Seeing my own case number typed on the top made my stomach clench. Margaret said the Carter family had received more than $40,000 during those years in support. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone in the back inhaled sharply. $40,000. My mind raced back to the thin sweaters I wore in winter, the lunches that never seemed enough, the hand-me-down jeans 2 sizes too big, the afternoons I spent alone while Lisa went to her dance classes and Aaron got new sports gear every season. The memories came fast and heavy, each one clicking into place with a painful kind of clarity. Linda stood suddenly, her chair scraping loud against the floor. She stammered that they had loved me like their own, that the money had gone to the household as a whole, that everything had been shared. Marga waited her off with a quiet firmness that seemed to freeze Linda mid-sentence. She said love did not look like exclusion. She said care did not look like humiliation in front of business partners. She said she had just witnessed exactly how this family treated me, and her voice held no doubt, only disappointment sharpened into steel. Richard lost whatever control he had been clinging to. His face turned a deep red as he slammed his hand on the table and shouted that I had always been a burden. The word hung in the air like smoke darkening the ceiling. A few guests flinched. Someone whispered that he should lower his voice. He did not. He kept talking. He said I had cost them time and energy. He said I had never fit in. He said adopting me had been Linda's idea. He said keeping me was a charity. I felt the heat rise in my face, but I stayed where I was. The shame did not swallow me this time. It rose, but it did not consume. I could feel Margaret watching me, waiting to see whether I would crumble or stand. She took a slow step closer, her eyes softening when they met mine. She told me that none of this had been my fault. She said I had never been protected in this house. She said every child deserved a safe place to land, but I had been given only walls. Her words pierced something tender inside me. Memories I had folded away carefully over the years began to open. The lonely birthdays, the silent dinners, the way I had always eaten last. How I had learned to apologize before anyone blamed me. How I had learned to disappear inside myself. I drew a breath that felt heavy and long and strangely free. Richard sputtered something about exaggeration, about outsiders meddling. He looked toward his business partners, then toward the guests who were now openly watching him with a mix of confusion and discomfort. Margaret closed the folder and held it neatly at her side. She said she wished this conversation could continue here, but the place was crowded and the air was too tense. She placed a hand on my back, warm and steady, and asked if I would step outside with her for a moment. I hesitated only a second before nodding. The room around us buzzed with new whispers as we walked toward the glass doors leading to the garden patio. The air outside felt cold and sharp, a clean contrast to the suffocating warmth of the ballroom. The snow was still falling, small flakes catching the light from the outdoor lamps. We walked a few steps away from the building until the noise of the party, muffled behind the glass. Margaret stood beside me, looking up at the drifting sky. She said quietly that truth never hurt as deeply as the lies people told to cover it. She said the night was not over, and neither was my story. I felt something shift inside me, something like the first breath after being underwater too long. As I looked back at the glowing windows of the country club, a strange certainty settled over me. My life was about to change, and not in a small way. It was only a question of how far the truth would go. The snow drifted gently around us as Margaret and I stood on the dimly lit patio, the soft glow from the ballroom casting long shadows across the stone tiles. My breath came out in shaky wisps, still carrying the sting of everything that had unfolded inside. I could hear faint laughter through the glass, the kind that had once belonged to a world I thought I was supposed to fit into. Standing out here, though, I realized how far away it had always been from me. Margaret undertaking her coat a little tighter around her shoulders and took a step toward the garden. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if she did not want her words to startle the night. I followed her, my heels sinking lightly into the thin layer of fresh snow. When we reached the edge of the patio, she stopped and looked out at the dark stretch of manicured lawn. She told me softly that this was where she needed to begin. With Anna, with the past that had been kept from me for so long. Her voice had a quiet steadiness, the kind that comes from holding a truth close to your heart for years. She said Anna had been more fire than stillness. A young woman who had lived life with color splashed across every corner of it. She had sketched constantly, filling page after page of notebooks with faces, flowers, strange shapes, she said made sense only to her. She had danced barefoot through the living room when she thought no one was watching. She had the kind of spirit that made strangers smile and made people who loved her worry for reasons they could not put into words. Margaret paused, her breath drifting through the cold air. She said Anna had also been fragile in ways she tried to hide. She felt deeply. She loved intensely. She feared disappointing people even more than she feared being trapped. The more pressure she felt at home, the harder she pushed back. Until the day she could no longer stay. Margaret's voice softened again. She said the arguments between them had reached a breaking point in the year 2000. Expectations had suffocated Anna, and she left, with nothing but her bags and her pride. She promised she would call. She never did. I listened in silence, each word peeling back another layer of a life I had never been allowed to imagine. My chest tightened with every detail. Seeing about my mother felt like hearing a piece of myself described for the first time. The restlessness, the quiet fear, the stubborn spark that always felt too big for the space I lived in. Margaret turned to me with eyes that flickered in the faint golden light from the patio lamps. She said she wished she had handled things differently, that she should have listened more, that she should have held Anna instead of trying to shape her. There was a heaviness in her voice that made my heart ache. I felt a sudden rush of memories from my childhood, the moments when I had wished someone would notice I was hurting. In the evenings, I had eaten alone at the kitchen counter, while the rest of the Carter family shared dessert in the dining room. The mornings I had walked to school with shoes that were worn thin, while Lisa and Aaron complained about the shoes they had received and did not like. The nights I had pretended to fall asleep to avoid hearing Richard tell Linda that taking me in had been a mistake. The lump in my throat grew sharper. Margaret looked toward the dark garden again. She told me she had searched everywhere when she found out Anna had died. Hospitals, shelters, foster systems scattered across counties. She had followed every thread until she reached an empty file or a dead end. State paperwork had been filled out wrong. Names had been typed incorrectly. My birth date had been switched with someone else's. She told me she had spent years trying to find me while believing I was somewhere safe. She said the truth crushed her when she realized I had been raised in a house that never embraced me. Her voice trembled only slightly as she apologized. She said she should have fought harder, moved faster, pressed deeper into the walls that kept her from me. She said she was sorry for every night I had cried in a room alone. Sorry for every moment I had believed I was unwanted. Sorry for the years she had missed. I closed my eyes, pressing back the tears that threatened to fall. The cold wind brushed against my cheeks, carrying with it a sting that felt almost cleansing. I whispered that I did not blame her, though the words felt too small to hold the truth inside me. Margaret breathed out, then straightened slightly, as if shifting from memory to something more present. She said there was a reason she had come here tonight, not just because she found, but because she needed to see for herself what kind of household Richard had built. She said he had invited her under the guise of showcasing a strong, loving family. He had told her that this gathering would demonstrate stability, warmth, and unity. He said she would see how well he treated the people in his care. Her jaw tightened. She shook her head slowly. She said she had expected a pleasant evening, but instead, she watched the man who wanted her company's money belittle his own adopted daughter in front of a room full of guests. She saw humiliation treated like entertainment. She saw a $15,270 bill shoved into my hands, as if cruelty had no price. She said no contract was worth that kind of character. Her words cut through the cold like a blade. I felt something inside me shift, as if the ground of my childhood had finally begun to crack in the open air. Then she turned to me fully and asked the question that made my breath catch. Do you want to leave this family? The question sat between us, suspended like the snowflakes drifting slowly toward the ground. I felt my pulse thrum in my throat. I had thought about leaving for years, but it had always felt impossible. People who lived in houses built on love knew how to walk away from things that hurt them. People like me learned how to endure, how to shrink, how to survive without drawing too much attention. I whispered that I did want to go, that I wanted to be free of the weight that had pressed on me for so long. But I confessed I did not know how to start. I did not know what life looked like without obligations tied to a name. That had never truly been mine. Margaret nodded with understanding in her eyes. She told me it was all right not to know where to begin. She said beginnings often grew out of endings we never expected. She took a slow breath. Then she told me something that made the snow seem to fall slower for a moment. She said she was scheduled to sign a contract with Carter Construction then, the next morning. A deal between $500,000 and $1 million. The kind of contract that could elevate or collapse a mid-sized company. She said her board had approved it. Her advisors had encouraged it. Everyone expected her signature by noon. But after tonight, she said she doubted she could move forward. She said a company could teach skills, build homes, or repair roads. But character came from the people who ran it. If the foundation was rotten, the structure would never stand. I felt the air leave my lungs as I realized what this meant. My life was about to collide with Richard's in a way I never imagined. The man who had reminded me at every turn that I owed him everything was about to lose the thing he valued most, because of the way he had treated me. Margaret held my gaze with a seriousness that made my heartbeat quicken. She said there was one more thing I needed to know, something about Richard's company, something that involved me far more deeply than I realized. Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. She told me that the truth inside those walls was only the beginning. Then she lifted her hand slightly and gestured toward a garden bench tucked beneath a snow-covered arbor. She said we should sit down for this part, because what she was about to tell me would change everything. We walked toward the garden bench Margaret had pointed to, the snow crunching softly beneath our shoes. The cold tightened the air, but my mind was too full to feel its bite. When we reached the bench, she brushed off a thin layer of frost with the side of her hand and urged me to sit. I lowered myself slowly, feeling my heartbeat throb through my chest in heavy, uneven waves. Marg remained standing for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she turned toward the ballroom doors. The faint glow from inside spilled out across the patio, casting shifting shapes on the snow as people moved beyond the glass. For a brief second, I wondered if Richard knew the ground beneath him had already begun to crack. Before Margaret could speak, the side door opened again, and a tall man stepped out. He was dressed in a dark winter coat over a suit, the kind of suit belonging to someone accustomed to courtrooms and boardrooms. His shoulders were broad, his expression measured, and a small silver badge clipped inside his coat glimmered when the light hit it. Margaret called out his name quietly, and he approached with a respectful nod. It was Ethan Morales. I had seen his name before on business articles shared around town. He was 38 years old, a senior attorney for Whitmore Holdings, the kind who handled corporate negotiations and high-profile disputes. He looked at me with a calm that steadied the air around us. He asked if I was all right. The question was simple, not prying, but something in the sincerity of it loosened a knot in my chest that had been tied for years. I nodded, though I was not sure it was true. He stood a few feet from us, glancing back at the glowing windows before returning his attention to Margaret. He said he had reviewed the documents she requested earlier that evening and that her instincts were correct. There were issues with Carter Development, serious ones. My breath hitched. I could feel the shift in Margaret's posture, the way she braced herself for details she already suspected. Ethan stepped closer, choosing his words with precision. He explained that Carter Development had been struggling financially for longer than they admitted. They owed money to subcontractors stretching back more than a year. Payments were delayed. Records were incomplete. Some invoices had suspicious gaps. I felt my palms grow cold. He continued, saying their financial transparency was poor. Funds moved between accounts without clear documentation. Exports appeared inflated in some areas and almost non-existent in others. The kind of pattern that suggested someone was hiding cracks in the foundation, hope no one would notice before they secured more money. Margaret watched him intently. Then Ethan said something that made my stomach twist. He told us that when reviewing historical filings, he discovered that my name appeared on several old tax documents connected to the Carter family. My name had been used to claim deductions and credits meant for guardians of children with certain classifications or disabilities, except I had never been diagnosed with anything that would qualify. My throat went dry. He said the filings were from years when I had been living in that house, years when I had eaten the leftovers from other people's plates, years when I wore sweaters with unraveling sleeves and shoes that should have been replaced long before they were, years when I'd asked myself quietly why I felt like the heaviest burden in a place where I was supposed to be cared for. I stared at the ground as the truth spread through me. I had not only been tolerated or sidelined, I was used to it. My existence had been turned into a convenient financial strategy, a deduction, a number. For a moment, I could not speak. Margaret sat beside me slowly, her presence grounding. She placed her hand near mine on the bench, not touching, but close enough to make me feel that I was not alone. She told Ethan to continue. He said Carter Development had been counting on the contract with Whitmore Holdings to keep the company afloat, somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million. Without that contract, they would likely face lawsuits, project cancellations, and even potential audits. My mind reeled. I thought about every time Richard had reminded me that I owed him. Every time he called me ungrateful. Every time he had told me that I should feel lucky. Lucky to sleep under his roof. Lucky to be fed. Lucky to exist in a place where I was reminded daily that I had no value unless I performed it. The irony of it twisted deep. It was not me who had been saved by them. It was them who had profited from me. Ethan paused, studying my face carefully, as if weighing whether the next part might break me. He said they had been preparing final documents for the contract earlier that day, week. Everything had been lined up, numbers calculated, dates settled, attorneys briefed. It had been a sure deal. Until tonight. He said with quiet certainty that after witnessing what happened, the agreement could no longer move forward without review. He told Margaret she had grounds to withdraw entirely, and she nodded in affirmation. The world around me suddenly felt strangely fragile, like a snow globe shaken too hard. I leaned back against the cold bench, trying to find steady breath. Everything inside me was shifting. Every memory I had ever made in that house felt different under this new light. Nights sitting alone in my room, days walking home from school while the others rode. The way dinners were stretched when I needed something, but grew generous again when guests arrived. It was all part of a larger truth I had never been given. I did not know whether to feel angry or numb. Before I could process any more, Ethan's phone buzzed sharply in his coat pocket. He hesitated for a moment, then checked the screen. His expression changed. He looked at Margaret first, then at me. He said he had just received a message from someone inside the ballroom. Someone had recorded the moment Richard told me to find another table. The moment he shouted that adopted girls did not belong with a real family. The moment the entire room laughed. Someone had captured it all. I felt my breath stop. Ethan said the video was already spreading online. Someone had posted it to a neighborhood group in Seattle, and from there, it had jumped to 2 larger community pages. Comments were pouring in. People were shocked, appalled, outraged. The cold air around us thickened with the weight of that revelation. Margaret kissed her head, her expression sharpening with focus. I finally managed to whisper the question forming in my mind. How fast is it spreading? Ethan glanced back at his phone. Then he met my eyes with a calm that did nothing to soften the impact of his words. He said the video was going viral across Seattle. I sat there on the garden bench long after Ethan's words landed, the cold air settling deeper into my coat as if it wanted to hold me still, long enough to absorb everything. The idea that a single recording could unravel years of silence felt unreal. I could almost see the moment playing out in my mind, captured from some corner of the ballroom, the sharpness of Richard's voice echoing louder than the music, the laughter spreading like a stain across the room. Now thousands of strangers were hearing those same words, and I felt both exposed and strangely vindicated. Margaret placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and said we should step inside soon, before the cold worked its way into my bones. I nodded, though my body felt stiff, as if rooted to the bench. When I finally pushed myself to stand, the world around me felt different, heavier in places, lighter in others. We walked back toward the doors, and I caught a glimpse of the ballroom before Margaret guided me through a side entrance. People were huddled together, faces lit by the glow of their phones. Some looked confused, others looked uneasy. A few looked outright disturbed. The atmosphere had changed completely, and I could feel it even without stepping inside. Marg and Ethan led me through a quieter hallway where the noise diminished. I leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to steady my breath. Every part of me felt suspended, as if I were caught between the life I had known and a future that was still forming. By the time I drove home that night, the city lights blurred against the windshield, and my thoughts swirled like the snowflakes flickering in the beams of passing headlights. I checked my phone once I reached my apartment, half expecting it to light up with messages, but it stayed quiet for a while. The silence was short-lived. Just after 11, my phone vibrated with a notification. Then another. Then 10 more. I stared at the screen as a link to the video appeared over and over again. People from college, old coworkers, a neighbor I barely remembered, even a childhood friend I had not spoken to in years. Each message held some variation of the same sentiment. Is this you? Are you all right? What happened? I clicked on the video once, and the sound of Richard's voice filled my apartment like a cold draft, slipping under a door. Hearing him to find another table hit differently when I watched it from the outside. I saw myself hesitate, then stiffen. I saw the server approach. I saw the room laugh. The humiliation had played out so quickly that I wondered how many times that same dynamic had repeated throughout my life, without a witness to confirm it. By midnight, the video had spread across several large community pages in Seattle. People were arguing in the comments. Older viewers especially wrote long messages about adopted children they had raised or known, about the pain of exclusion, about the cruelty etched into Richard's words. Younger viewers were harsher, calling him heartless, arrogant, and worse. Someone mentioned organizing a boycott of Carter Development. Someone else claimed they had worked with the company and were not surprised. Just after midnight, I received a message from an unknown number. It was from a journalist named Daniel Brooks. He introduced himself briefly in a calm, respectful tone and asked if I would be willing to talk about my experience growing up in the Carter household. He said many former foster children had reached out to him over the years, and stories like mine mattered. He did not ask for details. He simply said he wanted to listen if I ever felt ready. I sat there on my couch, staring at his message, unsure how to answer. Talking about what had happened felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. Before I could decide, my phone buzzed again. This time the notification came from a live video. The name on the screen made my stomach drop. It was from Victoria Carter. She was sitting on her bed, her makeup slightly smudged, her eyes swollen like she had been crying. She was talking rapidly, her voice edged with panic. She claimed she had nothing to do with the video and said people were attacking her unfairly. She insisted that I had always been dramatic, that I loved playing the victim, that she and Kevin had tried to include me in the family. She spoke fast, words tumbling over each other as she tried to make herself look innocent. Her tone grew sharper as she defended herself, until finally, she called the whole thing a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion. The comments rolling across her screen told another story. People were not buying it. Some posted clips from the original video, highlighting the moment Victoria's laughter broke through the noise. Others mentioned old stories she had shared online about being the favorite child. Someone even dug up a picture of her boasting about an expensive vacation. During the year Richard had told me we had no money for my school trip. The tide turned against her quickly. Her voice faltered. She attempted to explain again, but the comments flooded too fast. The live feed cut off abruptly, leaving a still frame of her panicked face frozen on the screen. I dropped my phone onto the couch and leaned back, letting out a long, shaky breath. I wanted to feel satisfied, maybe even vindicated. But instead, I felt a hollow tug behind my ribs. I had lived with these people for most of my life. Even if they had never treated me with real affection, seeing them unravel was disorienting. A few minutes later, another notification came in. This time it was from Kevin, the one who had always bragged about his father's business deals like they were trophies he had earned himself. Someone had recorded him earlier in the evening, talking loudly to his friends about a major contract his dad was about to secure. He had spoken with the same arrogance Richard carried, the same belief that he was entitled to admiration. The clip showed his friends responding awkwardly, shifting from amusement to discomfort. Now that the video of Richard had surfaced, those same friends were leaving comments calling Kevin out, mocking the confidence he had displayed. At almost the same time, a post from Linda appeared on my feed. She had written a long message about being misunderstood. She said she had always tried her best. She said my hurt was my interpretation, not reality. She said families were complex, and people should not judge without knowing both sides. The comments beneath her post tore through her defense. People who had known her for years, neighbors, church acquaintances, former co-workers, all responded with versions of the same sentiment. They said she had always favored her biological children. They said they had noticed how I was excluded. Someone even mentioned a Thanksgiving years ago when they saw me clearing plates while the others sat talking by the fire. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Richard. I stared at the screen as it rang, the vibration pulsing through my hand, each buzz tightening the air around me. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something inside me said to answer. His voice came through tight and furious the moment I picked up. He said I was destroying the family. He said I had allowed strangers to judge us. He said I was overreacting and making the situation worse. His words slammed into me like a storm, the same pattern I had known my whole life. Accuse, blame, shame, repeat. I waited until he paused long enough to breathe. Then I told him the truth in the simplest way I could. I told him I had done nothing. I had not posted anything. I had not stirred anything. I had only been recorded. For a moment, there was silence on the line. A long, cold silence that felt like a crack splitting open between us. He muttered something unintelligible, a mix of frustration and disbelief, then hung up without another word. I let the phone fall into my lap. The apartment felt too quiet now, as if the walls themselves were listening to everything unravel. A few minutes later, Another notification appeared. This one was short and clear. It was from Margaret. She asked me to come to her office the next morning. I stared at the message as the weight of it settled in. Something told me that whatever waited for me tomorrow would be bigger than anything that had happened tonight. And I was finally ready to hear it. The morning light came in pale and cold through my apartment windows. The sky over Seattle washed in a quiet gray that felt like the world was holding its breath with me. I barely slept, not because I was afraid, but because everything inside me felt suspended between the life I had lived and the one that was beginning to take shape. When I finally stepped outside, the snow on the sidewalks had been pushed into uneven piles, and the air carried the kind of winter chill that woke you fully, whether you wanted it or not. Whitmore Holdings building rose in sharp, clean lines above the street, its glass catching the muted morning light. I walked through the front revolving doors and felt a shift in the air there. The moment I stepped inside, the lobby was warm, quiet, and full of subtle elegance. Marble floors, soft lighting, large framed photographs of Seattle's waterfront. It felt like a place where people spoke with intention, not noise. A receptionist greeted me kindly and told me that Margaret had been expecting me. Her voice carried a warmth that soothed some of the tension wrapped around my shoulders. She directed me to a set of elevators along the far wall. I pressed the button for the 40th floor and watched the doors close around me as the elevator hummed upward. When the doors opened, I found Margaret standing near the windows of her office, looking out over the city. Her coat draped neatly on a nearby chair, and her posture was straight, but not rigid. The posture of someone prepared, but thoughtful. She turned when she heard me step inside, and her face softened. She told me I looked tired, but stronger than I had the night before. I managed a small smile, though my voice felt tight as I greeted her. She motioned for me to sit on the sofa near the window, then took the seat opposite me. There was a file open on the coffee table between us, and she rested her fingertips lightly on it. The silence stretched for a long moment before she finally spoke. She said she had spent the morning reviewing everything. The video, Ethan's findings, the records from years ago. My name appeared on documents I had never seen, the things she had witnessed with her own eyes. Then she told me in a clear, steady voice that she would not sign the contract with Carter Development. She said she would not tie Whitmore Holdings to a family that treated a child in their care with cruelty. She said character mattered more than business. She said walking away was not only the correct decision, it was the necessary one. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. The weight of those words settled into me like warm relief and cold fear at the same time. Higher because someone powerful finally stood on the side of my truth. Fear because I knew what this would mean for the Carters, for Richard, for the life I had known. Before I could speak, the door opened and Ethan walked in. He carried a stack of documents in one hand and a tablet in the other. He greeted me with a nod that felt strangely comforting, then placed the papers on the table. He explained that he had drafted the formal cancellation notice. It outlined Whitmore Holdings' withdrawal from negotiations and cited concerns about financial inconsistencies as well as ethical misalignment. He said Margaret would sign it within the hour, and the news would reach Carter Development by early afternoon. My stomach tightened. I asked what would happen next. Ethan sat down across from me and said quietly that this was only the first step. He said the financial irregularities he had discovered needed to be reported, not as punishment, but because they were required by law. He said he had already prepared a simplified summary of the issues, removing dense technical terminology, and intended to send it to the appropriate state office that afternoon. The room felt colder for a moment, not because of fear, but because of the finality in his tone. Margaret reached over and touched my hand lightly. She said I was not responsible for any of this. She said the consequences were the result of choices made long before I arrived. I tried to steady my breath, but it came shaky. For a while, none of us spoke. Then Ethan excused himself to send an email and make a series of calls. I listened to the faint click of the door closing behind him and felt a strange quiet settle over the room. Margaret asked if I wanted tea, and I nodded. She stepped to a small counter near the bookshelf and poured hot water into a ceramic cup. The scent of chamomile drifted between us. When she handed it to me, the warmth seeped into my fingers and softened some of the trembling. As I held the cup, I asked her if she had expected any of this. She shook her head slowly. She said she had sensed that something was wrong when she first met Richard, but she had not imagined the depth of the problem or the cruelty she witnessed. She told me she was proud of me. Proud of the way I held my ground, poor of the quiet strength she saw in me, sad that I did not crumble in the face of humiliation. Her voice held emotion that almost made me look away, but I forced myself to meet her eyes. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. The office door opened again, but this time Ethan returned with a solemn expression. He said the notice had been sent. Within minutes, the Carter office would receive the message informing them the deal was off. I stared out the window, imagining the chaos that would erupt inside their conference room. I pictured Richard reading the message, his face shifting from confusion to anger to panic. I pictured Linda trying to soothe him or blame me. I pictured Victoria pacing and ranting about the unfairness of it all. I pictured Kevin sinking into embarrassment as the friends who once admired him and realized the promises he made were empty. Ethan received a call a few minutes later and stepped aside to answer it. His expression tightened as he listened. When he returned, he said someone from inside Carter Development had confirmed the message arrived. He said Richard had slammed his desk hard enough to make the receptionist jump. He said raised voices had filled the hallway. Someone had overheard fragments of an argument. Words like ruined and betrayal and she will regret this. My hands tightened around the cup. He said the fallout had begun. Margaret teed back straight, her face unreadable. She asked Ethan if the report had been sent. He nodded. He said several agencies would now be reviewing Carter Development's filings. He said the process would take time, but the concerns were serious enough that the company would face questions they might not be able to answer. As he spoke, the room around me seemed to tilt. My mind moved through memories like pages in a worn journal. I saw myself sitting at the kitchen table completing homework, while Linda and the kids talked about vacations and new purchases I was never part of. I saw myself walking behind them in grocery stores, carrying heavier bags. I saw myself folding laundry that was not mine. I saw myself being told to be grateful, to stay quiet, to take what I was given. For years, their words had twisted reality until I questioned my own worth. Now the truth was unraveling their lies faster than they could contain it. Margaret leaned over and placed her hand on my arm again. She told me that feeling conflicted did not mean I was doing something wrong. She said trauma made loyalty complicated. She said strength sometimes looked like standing still long enough to understand the past. I pressed my lips together, unable to trust my voice. The hours that followed inside that office were quiet but heavy. Ethan stepped in and out, bringing updates from people monitoring online reaction. He said several partners in the construction industry were quietly distancing themselves from Carter Development. He said an influencer who had recently signed a small brand deal with Victoria had terminated the contract, citing concerns about her public behavior. He said Kevin's employer had suspended him after his comments in the viral clips came to light. Each piece of news landed like a stone in a still pond, not loud, but deep. The afternoon sun shifted across the floor as time passed. Marg ordered a simple lunch and insisted I eat, though my appetite was weak. Her insistence felt more like care than pressure, and I managed a few slow bites. At one point, Ethan brought in a printout of an article draft from a journalist. He said the piece was scheduled to be published soon. It did not mention my name, but it described the incident at the country club and the financial inconsistencies under investigation. The tone was firm but fair. I felt my throat tighten as I read it. Then, late in the afternoon, Ethan's tablet chimed again. He glanced at the screen and took a slow breath. He turned it toward Margaret first, then toward me. Daniel Brooks had just published the first part of his investigation in the Seattle Chronicle. The headline sat at the top of the screen like a doorway opening onto another world. My pulse thudded in my ears as I stared at the words. They felt heavy with truth, heavy with consequence, heavy with everything that had brought us here. Marge repeated her hand slightly, signaling calm, but her eyes were sharp with understanding. Everything was about to change again. The headline on Daniel Brooks's article was still frozen on the tablet screen, in front of me, when the next wave of messages and alerts began hitting. Margaret's phone, one after another. I could hear them faintly from where I sat near the window. Soft chimes, a low vibration, then another, and another. Each sound felt like the world outside was tightening around the truth that had finally surfaced. I stared at the skyline of Seattle through the glass. The sun was beginning its slow dip, drawing the tops of the high-rises a muted gold. The city, but somewhere in the hum of that enormous place, people, they were reacting. They were forming opinions. And for the story being told about me wasn't twisted by the Carter's version of events. It was just the truth. Marg, meantime, came closer and placed a hand gently on my shoulder. She did not rush me. She did not fill the silence with words meant to soothe. She simply stood there, steady and warm, the way I imagined a real grandmother might. I whispered that everything felt unreal. She nodded. This portrayal when you had lived a long time being told something else entirely. Before I could respond, Ethan stepped back into the office. He was holding his phone and a stack of printed messages, his expression serious but not panicked. He said that the Chronicle article was being shared rapidly, especially in Seattle and Tacoma. He said comments were pouring in. Most people were outraged. Some were heartbroken. Margaret asked if there had been any response from Carter Development. Ethan said yes. He said someone had given a short statement to a reporter claiming the article was defamatory. But the reporter had reached out to others, including a former employee who contradicted the Carter's version of events. A former employee. My pulse jumped. I asked Ethan who it was. He read the name from his phone, then said the man had worked for the Carters nearly a decade earlier. He had told the Chronicle that Richard Carter used to refer to me as the adopted burden whenever he was frustrated, like I was a line item on a spreadsheet, not a child. The man said he had heard Richard complain that the adoption tax credits weren't enough to offset my presence in the household. He had thought it was an ugly joke at first, but the more he saw, the more he realized Richard meant it. I covered my mouth with my hand as Ethan spoke. My eyes burned. I felt something in my chest twist painfully, but not with surprise. It was painful because it confirmed things I had always felt but never had the courage to name. Margaret stepped closer and told me softly to breathe. She said that truth could cut, but it also freed. I tried, but the air seemed thick for a moment, like my lungs forgot how to work. Then Ethan added that the former employee had also given a statement about mismanaged funds and disappearing invoices. He said investigators were already asking for more information from the state oversight office. He said Carter Development had lost one contract earlier that day because the board did not want to be associated with the unfolding scandal. I looked down at my hand, remembering how those same hands once washed the Carters' dishes, folded their laundry, and cleared their holiday tables, while their real children sat laughing in front of the television. All those years I told myself that if I worked harder, if I tried more, if I stayed quiet, maybe someday they would see me. But now I could see clearly that they never wanted to. And they never would have. The realization settled over me slowly, like the final piece of a puzzle slipping into place. It hurt, but it was clean. Honest. It did not feel like a wound that would fester. It felt like one that would eventually heal. I turned toward Margaret and asked her something I had been afraid to ask since the night she walked into the ballroom. I asked her about my mother. Her face softened immediately, the lines around her eyes shifting with emotion. She motioned to the chair beside her desk and invited me to sit. I did, and she lowered herself into the seat across from me. Ethan gave us privacy. Step into the hallway and closing the door behind him. Marg resulted her hands in her lap and looked at me with a tenderness that made my throat tighten. She said Anna had been a bright girl, sensitive, artistic. She painted in bright colors that drew the eye, wrote poems in margins of notebooks, and had a way of noticing small things no one else saw. But she also struggled. She felt suffocated by the expectations placed on her. The pressure to marry well, the pressure to stay close, the pressure to be someone she was not. Margaret paused and glanced toward the window as if searching for words. She said that when Anna found out she was pregnant, she wanted to come home. She tried. She had even written a letter. But something happened. Fear, pride, illness. Margaret was not sure. All she knew was that Anna did not make it back. And by the time Margaret found out what had happened, Anna was gone, and I was in the foster system. I felt the tears before I felt the breath that carried them. They came slow at first, then steadier. Not a breakdown. Not the loud, shaking sobs I had cried in secret as a child. These tears felt older, wiser somehow. They carried grief I had been holding inside for nearly 3 decades. Margaret moved to my side quietly and placed her hand on my back. She did not try to stop the tears. She waited with me, her presence heavy with love and loss both. When I could speak again, I asked why no one ever told me Anna had wanted to come home, why no one told me she had tried to fix things. Why did no one ever tell me she fought for me? Margaret shook her head slowly. She said the records were a mess back then, misfiled documents, incorrect dates, a hospital transfer that had been recorded wrong. She said she had spent years searching through agencies and offices, trying to find any clue. It was not until a year ago that she finally found the last piece that connected the missing parts of the story. She told me that Anna had not abandoned me. My mother had been trying to get back to me until her illness took away her chance. My vision blurred again. The room felt warm and heavy with everything unsaid. I whispered that I wished I had known. Margaret grayed as she wishes she had found me sooner. We sat together in that quiet stillness for a long time. Then she rose and said there was something she wanted to show me. She led me down a hallway past a series of framed photographs. The carpet softened our steps. At the end of the hall was a wooden door with a key in the lock. She turned it gently and pushed it open. Inside was a small storage room with high shelves, labeled boxes, and a table beneath a single warm lamp. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. It felt sacred somehow, like a private archive of lives preserved carefully. Margaret walked to a shelf on the far wall and lifted down a box with my mother's name written on it in tidy ink. She set it on the table and opened the lid. Inside were photographs, sketchbooks, a small stack of letters, a scarf in soft, faded blue, a wooden frame holding a picture of Anna, sitting on a bench overlooking the Sound, her hair blown by the wind. She handed me the photograph. I traced the edge with my thumb, staring at the woman who had given me life. Her smile was gentle. Her eyes were bright and full of something that looked like possibility. I asked Margaret if she could tell me more about Anna. She smiled, and for the next stretch of time, she did. She told me about Anna's favorite books, the way she loved blueberry pancakes, her habit of humming under her breath when she painted. She told me about the time Anna tried to dye her hair red and ended up with a shade closer to orange. She told me about the arguments they had, but also the nights they stayed up talking until morning. Each story felt like a stitch pulling something torn back together. Eventually, my hands stilled on one of the notebooks. I felt a shifting in the air just before the door opened quietly behind us. Ethan stood there, holding a folder that looked significantly older than the ones he usually carried. His expression was different this time. Seriously, thoughtful, almost delicate. He said he had found something. Margaret repeated toward him, her eyes narrowing in that sharp, intuitive way she had. Ethan stepped closer and placed the folder on the table between us. He said it had been buried deep in the archives accessed during the search for my records. He said it appeared to relate to Anna's estate, a document never processed fully because of the chaos surrounding her illness and death. A document that might affect my legal standing now. My breath caught. Margaret asked what kind of document it was. Ethan opened the folder and pulled out a set of papers, yellowed slightly with age. He said it appeared to reference an inheritance, a right that had never been assigned or claimed. A right belonging to Anna, and possibly to me. My heart thudded once, sharp and loud. Ethan looked at me and said quietly that this might change everything. For a few long seconds, I could not move. The words Ethan had just spoken seemed to vibrate in the air between us. Faith, but insistent, like a bell that kept ringing even after the hand left the rope. A right belonging to Anna, and possibly to me. I stared at the old papers resting on the table and felt the weight of all the years I had lived without knowing anything about where I came from or what had been meant for me. It was almost too much to take in. Margaret stepped closer and placed her hand lightly on the folder, her expression softening with something that looked like relief mixed with sorrow. She said quietly that Anna had been listed as a beneficiary of early Class A shares in Whitmore Holdings back in the late 1990s, long before her life took the turn that separated her from the family. Those shares had never been reassigned because the paperwork had stalled when she became ill. Only the first half of the process had been completed, the part where the shares had been put into Anna's name. The transfer to her child, which should have happened after her passing, never did. I swallowed hard and asked if that meant I was the legal heir. Ethan nodded. He explained that according to the trust laws in Washington state at the time, any minor child named by relation in an uncompleted transfer would have inherited by default, unless another guardian had been legally appointed to take possession for the child. No one had done that. The Carters had never known. They had never been notified, and the state had closed Anna's file too quickly for the system to flag anything else. So it had been waiting. All these years. Waiting in a drawer somewhere for someone to finally look with the right eyes. I felt my hands shake as I reached out and touched the edge of the paper. It was strange to look at something so thin and fragile and know it had the power to change the course of my entire life. I felt a tightness behind my eyes, but I blinked it back, trying to stay present, grounded, steady. I was not that frightened little girl anymore who backed into corners and tried to make herself small. I looked at Margaret and said that I did not know how to make sense of any of this. She gave a small nod and said she understood. She said she had spent years imagining the day she might be able to tell me pieces of the truth about where I came from, but she never once expected that the truth would hold something this substantial. She said this was not about money or influence. It was about the fact that Anna had wanted her child to have a place in them, family she had run away from, but still loved in ways she could never fully explain. I sat down slowly. My legs felt unsteady, like my body was still trying to catch up to everything my mind was absorbing. I asked Ethan what this meant in practical terms. He sat across from me and explained in clear, gentle language that the shares represented a minority stake in Whitmore Holdings, one that came with voting rights and a long-term dividend structure. He said it would not affect the leadership of the company, but it gave me a seat at the table if I ever wanted it. It also meant I had a direct connection to the Whitmore Foundation, the philanthropic branch of the company that had been part of Margaret's work for decades. I thought of Anna. I thought of the little information I had known about her for most of my life. An artist, a dreamer, a young woman running from something she could not face. I wondered if she had ever imagined that her daughter might someday be sitting in a warm, quiet room, being told she had been part of something stable and dignified all along, even if she never knew it. I told Margaret I did not know if I was ready for any of this. She came to sit beside me. Her shoulders slouched slightly, the way older women sometimes sit when they want to appear less formal and more human. She said she understood fear. She said she had spent years wishing for a chance to do something right. She said she did not want to take the place of my mother. She only wanted to complete what Anna could not finish. Her voice shook a little on the word mother. Mine nearly broke on the word finish. I asked. She shook her head. She said she expected nothing. She said the shares were not an obligation. They were a gift that had been waiting for me. She said I could choose my own path. I could stay involved, or I could walk away. I could make use of the resources, or keep them quietly. She said the only thing she hoped was that I would consider joining the advisory circle of the Whitmore Foundation, because the foundation was dedicated to helping children who had been raised in settings like the one I had survived. Children who had been dismissed or neglected or treated as obligations rather than souls with worth. I felt something in my chest shift. It was not scary this time. It was recognition, a thread connecting my past to something meaningful in the future. Before I could say anything, the door to the room vibrated faintly as a phone buzzed from the hallway. Ethan excused himself to check it. When he returned, he looked troubled. He said the Carter situation was deteriorating faster than expected. Another news outlet had picked up the story. A second contractor had just announced they were suspending their partnership with Carter Development until further notice. People were commenting publicly about unpaid invoices. Someone had leaked a memo suggesting that Carter Development had been under internal review for nearly 6 months. It was all unraveling at once. I felt my stomach clench. Even after everything they had done to me, I did not want to see anyone lose their livelihood. I told Ethan that I did not want to be the cause of anyone's suffering. He shook his head and said gently that I was not responsible for any of it. He said these issues had been building for years, He said the truth had simply arrived at a moment when the public was ready to hear it. As he spoke, my mind drifted briefly back to the country club, the cold white lights, the polished silverware, the laughter that rolled across the room like a tide the moment Richard Carter pointed at me and told me to go find another table. The way people watched, the way no one stopped it, the way I had quietly paid the $15,270 bill without anyone offering so much as a comforting hand. I realized then that some consequences belonged exactly where they landed. Margaret must have sensed my thoughts. She put her hand lightly on my arm and said that cruelty always grows best in silence. But it also collapses fastest under truth. For the first time, I felt the weight of my own silence lifting. Ethan asked if I wanted to hear the rest of the updates. I nodded. He said that according to multiple sources, Richard had returned home in a rage. Neighbors reported shouting. Someone claimed Linda had left the house earlier that afternoon with a suitcase. Social media showed that Victoria had already deleted her influencer accounts after the video backlash. Kevin had posted a long paragraph about people turning against his family, and the comments under his post were almost entirely critical. I closed my eyes for a moment. The image of their house came into my mind. I had lived there from the time I was 6 until I aged out of foster status at 18. 14 years of holidays, chores, whispered arguments, forgotten birthdays, hand-me-down clothes, carefully measured affection. I never hated them. I just always believed I needed to earn their approval. Now, 18 years after that first night under their roof, I was watching the structure of their lives crumble from the outside. I whispered that I did not want revenge. Margretis nodded and said she believed me. She said justice and revenge were not the same thing. Justice brought light. Revenge brought more darkness. She said what was happening now was not my doing. It was their own choices catching up to them. She asked gently if I would like tea. I laughed, a small laugh full of tiredness and relief. I said yes. She moved to the small kitchen area connected to the archive room and began to warm water on a portable kettle. The sound filled the quiet like a soft rhythm. When she returned with 2 mugs, she sat beside me again and asked how I felt about the inheritance. I took a long sip before answering. I told her that I felt overwhelmed, but also strangely steady, that I felt like I was standing on a threshold I did not even know existed. That part of me wanted to say yes to everything because it meant being connected to Anna. But another part of me was afraid of stepping into a family that had its own expectations and traditions, ones I did not know if I belonged in. Margaret listened with deep attention. When I finished, she said that belonging was something that grew slowly. She said family was not a prize handed to someone. It was a relationship built over time. She said I did not have to rush or decide out of fear. She said she would accept any decision I made. Her kindness felt like a soft blanket laid gently over my shoulders. As we sat there, the room bathed in the warm glow of the single lamp, I thought of the foundation Margaret had mentioned. The Whitmore Foundation had been her life's work after her husband died. Its purpose was simple, but profound. It helped children who had experienced emotional neglect or domestic instability. It funded counseling. It sponsored educational programs. It provided emergency support for kids who fell through the cracks of the work system. It was the kind of place Anna might have wanted to exist when she was alive. I asked Margaret quietly if she thought I could be part of the foundation, without stepping fully into the business side of the company. She smiled and said, of course. She said the foundation was not corporate, it was human. She said what I had survived and what I understood firsthand made me someone whose voice could guide decisions others could not dream of making with the same clarity. I felt something inside me settle, a place where direction began to form. Not fully, but enough. The door opened again, and Ethan stepped inside with a more composed expression. He said there was one final update I needed to hear before the evening ended. He had run the documents through a preliminary verification process using the company's internal legal database. The shares were legitimate. The trust language was intact, and as of this moment, I was officially recognized as the sole legal heir to Anna Whitmore's unassigned shares. I exhaled slowly. My life had changed in a matter of days. First, humiliation. Then, the truth. Then, family I never knew I had. Now, inheritance. It felt like being swept along by a current stronger than anything I had ever imagined. Margaret reached for my hand. She said softly that tomorrow morning we would go to the notary to begin the official claiming process. Then she said something that made my chest warm in a way I did not expect. She said I did not have to decide anything tonight. She said tomorrow would bring its own clarity. She said the only thing I needed to do now was rest. I nodded. My body suddenly felt heavier, like the full day had finally settled into my bones. Ethan helped gather the papers. Margaret closed the box containing Anna's belongings and said we would revisit it when I felt ready. Before we left the archive room, I took one last look around. The shelves, the photographs, the quiet, and the folder that had been waiting decades for someone to open it. Then we stepped back into the hallway. The lights were dim. The house was peaceful. And for the first time since everything began, I felt something rare and steady settling deep inside me, a sense that I might finally be walking toward the life I was meant to have. The decision waiting for me tomorrow felt enormous, but also somehow clear. Understood. I will write Chapter 10 exactly as required, picking up from the last sentence of Chapter 9, using clean text. No special characters. No colons, no quotation marks except inside the final CTA quote. No hyphens or long dashes, natural American English, first person, emotional, for older women, around 2,000 words. I will begin writing now. Chapter 10. I followed Margaret and Ethan down the quiet hallway, my steps soft against the carpet as if the house itself were holding its breath. The night felt heavy, but gentle, like the final moments before a snowfall. We reached the foyer, where the soft glow of a table lamp cast shadows across the framed artwork and the polished wooden floors. A strange calm moved through me. My life had shifted so dramatically in such a short time, yet walking beside Margaret no longer felt overwhelming. It felt like walking towards something I had unknowingly been searching for. Ethan helped me into my coat and handed me a file folder, telling me to keep it with me overnight. It contained copies of the preliminary documents and the notes from the legal verification. He promised they would go over everything again in the morning, step by step, without rushing me. I nodded, grateful for the steadiness in his voice. Margaret reached out and adjusted the collar of my coat like it was the most natural thing in the world. The gesture made my throat tighten. It had been years since anyone touched me with such simple, unspoken care. She walked me to the door and said she would see me in the morning at 10. Then she squeezed my hand, warm and firm, and told me gently to let myself rest. I stepped out into the crisp night air, the door closing softly behind me, and stood for a moment on the porch, watching my breath drift like small clouds. That night, back in my small apartment, I sat on the floor near my bed with the file open in front of me. Papers lay scattered, the outlines of my mother's handwriting drifting back and forth in my mind. Every so often I would pick up one of the documents, read a line, then let it fall gently onto the carpet. I felt like a person who had lived years in a dark room, only to discover that the walls were actually windows. I had simply never known how to look. Sleep came in short waves. I woke several times, unable to stop thinking about the morning ahead. But I was not afraid. Not the way I used to be. I felt something new taking root deep inside me, something that felt like strength. By the time sunlight spread across my bedroom walls, I had already showered, dressed, and packed the first 2 boxes of belongings I knew I wanted to take with me. I paused with my hand on the final box, thinking of the years I spent believing this apartment was all the safety I could claim. Now it felt like a chapter closing. At 10 exactly, a black sedan arrived in front of my building. The driver stepped out and opened the back door, addressing me politely. I settled into the seat and watched the city pass by through the window. Christmas decorations still hung along the sidewalks, glittering in the morning light. Somewhere out there, people were going to work, sipping coffee, taking phone calls. Life carried on, unaware of the turning point waiting for me on Lake Union. The car pulled through the iron gates of the Whitmore estate. The mansion rose above the water like something out of a memory I had never lived, but somehow recognized. Clean lines, tall windows, and a view of the lake that shimmered beneath the winter sun. The air smelled crisp, like pine and cold air sweeping down from the Cascades. Margaret stood on the front step, wrapped in a wool coat the color of deep cranberry. She waved as the car pulled up, and the warmth of that simple gesture steadied me. When I stepped out, she walked to me and linked her arm with mine, as if it had always been her place to do so. Inside the mansion, the air felt warm and bright. Staff moved quietly in the hallways, respectful but kind. Margaret guided me to the drawing room where several people stood waiting, dressed in tailored suits that carried a weight of formality without feeling intimidating. She explained that these were members of the board, people who had worked with her for years, people she trusted. When we entered, the room fell silent. The board members turned toward us. Margaret introduced me slowly, her voice thoughtful and steady. She said I was Anna's daughter. She said I was the rightful heir to the shares that had never been claimed. She said I had my mother's quiet strength and her light. A long pause followed. Then one of the board members stepped forward, an older man with kind eyes. He extended his hand to me and said they were honored to welcome me. One by one, the others followed. Their handshakes were warm. Their words were gentle. And for the first time in my life, I felt seen in a way that did not ask me to shrink or apologize. After the introductions, Marg dealt me to a sunlit room overlooking the lake. The water rippled beneath the soft movement of the wind. She motioned for me to sit while she spoke with the others. I watched her across the room, standing tall, poised, every gesture full of quiet authority. I wondered how long she had carried the ache of losing Anna, and how deeply she must have hoped for this moment, even if she never said so aloud. When the meeting was done, Margaret and Ethan returned to me. They explained the next steps of the legal process, all in simple words, careful to keep every detail clear without making me feel overwhelmed. I listened closely, letting their voices guide me. Then Margaret asked if I would accept a position within the foundation. Not a corporate role, not something that required navigating boardrooms or financial directives. She offered me the role of creative advisor, someone who would help shape outreach programs and advocate for children who had lived through experiences like mine. I felt something warm spread through my chest. I said yes. Margaret smiled, her eyes soft and bright. She touched my cheek gently and said Anna would be proud. Later that afternoon, she showed me the guest wing where I would stay for as long as I needed. The room overlooked the lake. The bedding was soft, the colors soothing, the furniture arranged with care. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around, feeling the weight of years lifting one breath at a time. We spent the rest of the day sorting through my belongings with unexpected ease. Ethan helped move the boxes from my apartment. Margin insisted on carrying one herself, despite my protests. She said she needed to feel part of the moment. I understood. We were both grieving and healing in our own ways, and sometimes the smallest actions carried the deepest meaning. That evening, after dinner in the dining room facing the lake, I walked outside to the patio with a wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders. Snow had begun to fall again, gentle and fine, dusting the railing with white. The water reflected the light of the house, turned the lake into a shimmering silver path. I sat on a cushioned bench and opened the letter my mother had written all those years ago. I read each word slowly, letting them fill me without rushing. Her handwriting curved and lifted across the page, delicate and full of emotion. She had written that she wanted me to grow up in love. She had written that she wanted me to know my worth. She had written that she hoped I would find a home where I felt safe. As I read, tears slipped quietly down my cheeks, but they were not heavy tears. They felt like the release that comes after holding breath too long. Margaret stepped outside a few minutes later, wrapped in her own coat. She did not ask if she could sit beside me. She simply sat. I leaned against her shoulder, and she rested her cheek on the top of my head. The snow fell around us, soft and quiet. She whispered that Anna would have wanted this for me. A home, a family, a future built on truth, not silence. She said she wished she could have given it to me sooner. I reached for her hand and held it tightly. I told her she was giving it to me now. That was enough. We stayed there until the cold crept into our fingers, and the snow had grown thicker. Inside, the house glowed warm and bright. When we returned to the living room, the fire crackled softly in the fireplace. I curled up on the sofa with a blanket while Margaret made tea. She handed me a mug and sat beside me once again. I looked around the room and felt something settle deep inside me. A sense of belonging. Not forced, not conditional, just a present. Later that night, in the quiet of my room, I opened a small journal I had brought from my old apartment. I wrote down everything I remembered about Anna. The bracelet, the photograph, the details Margaret had shared. I wanted to keep those pieces safe. I wanted to build a bridge between the life I'd lost and the life I had now. I wrote until my hand grew tired. When I finally set the journal aside, I walked to the window and looked out at the lake one more time. Snowflakes drifted in slow spirals, landing softly on the dark water. I whispered that I was ready. The next morning came gently. I met with the board again, signed preliminary documents, and began planning my first involvement with the foundation. We discussed community outreach, creative workshops, and programs that focused on emotional support for children of fractured homes. I felt purpose moving through me like a steady current. In the afternoon, Margaret showed me the garden behind the mansion. Even in winter, it held a quiet beauty. We walked along the path, our footsteps crunching softly in the thin layer of snow. She told me stories about the early days of the foundation, about the families they had helped, about the moments that had brought her the most joy. I listened with my heart open. Later, as the sun dipped lower across the lake, we returned to the patio. I stood with my hands resting lightly on the railing and let the cold air brush against my face. I thought back to the country club, the laughter, the humiliation, the bill, the silence. And I realized something very clearly. That night had not destroyed me. It freed me. It had led me here, standing beside the water, ready to step into a life built on honesty, love, and dignity. I whispered to the lake that I had finally found my roots. Not in a house that never saw me, but in the truth of who I was meant to be. Later that evening, as Margaret and I sat in the living room sharing tea, she asked if I was ready to speak to the foundation staff the next week. I told her I was. She smiled and said that she believed I would change lives. I felt warmth spread through my chest, a feeling I had not known before. Hope. When I finally went upstairs to my room, I paused at the top of the staircase and looked back at the living room below. The fire glowed. The house felt alive. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt safe. Truly safe. As I lay in bed, I whispered into the quiet darkness that family was not something assigned. It was chosen. It was earned. It was protected. My life had begun in uncertainty, wandered through shadows, and now found its place in the light. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, knowing that tomorrow would bring new beginnings, not fear. And for the first time, I drifted into sleep without bracing for the world to shift beneath me. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.